All right. So I'm Xerxes Arsiwalla. As Nico said, I'm currently at Wolfram. I'm also affiliated to Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, but most of the time now I'm working for Stephen Wolfram. And this talk is going to be about a paper which got recently published, but you could say that this is a pre-Chat GPT paper. There isn't any Chat GPT in the paper, and just before it was getting published, that's when all this came out, but I didn't want to change the paper. I just wanted to keep it that way. I'm happy to discuss, first I'll just discuss the core message of this paper, and then we could keep the discussion as open or flexible on things related to current AI and also to other things we do at Wolfram, which is not exactly related to neuroscience, more physics, interest of mine, which, I mean, at a deep level, those things are not that unrelated, but I'll not try to mix too many things so that it doesn't look like a mess. Okay, I'll just go ahead and first acknowledge my co-authors on this paper, Ricard Solé, who's a professor of synthetic biology at Pompeu Fabra. Clément Moudofrière is now a faculty at Bordeaux. Ivan Herreros is working in industry. Marty Sanchez is a newly appointed faculty at Pompeu Fabra, and Paul Fashour is professor at Donders Institute. So these were the, in fact, these were the people at that time. We are all, except for Ricard, who was in the university, the rest of us were all in the lab of Paul at that time. Okay, so what are the key motivations for this work? In this, just as a warning, I won't really be addressing much about qualia, or anything for that matter about qualia. This paper wasn't even, our goal wasn't to really talk about what might be the origins of some new theory of consciousness. It's not about a new theory. Rather, it is a taxonomy of complexity to understand the problem of consciousness, because given that all major theories are all taking a stance on some type of process, a lot of them on information theoretic processes, etc., trying to put information either at the core of the subject or so on and so forth, and making all sorts of definitions of what qualia might be in relation to that. So our task was, in this work was, okay, let's just try to parse what we mean by information. And if information refers to some kind of complexity, let's try to parse that complexity and build a taxonomy which is general enough that one can compare biological and synthetic agents. So even if we don't know what is consciousness, or we don't try to define what is consciousness, if we can compare these things on a functional level, at the level of functional competences, then we might get some insight into the design principles of what one might call conscious or intelligent. What is the interaction between the two? So in a sense, the first part of this work was to try to parse the relevant complexity metrics that would be general enough to capture a whole range of systems from not just from AI and biological beings, but also synthetic biology and social robotics, etc. Okay, so without much ado, let me just make one comment on some of the current theories of consciousness. As you know, this is, I'll just take two examples, IIT and global workspace, but what the arguments are making are a bit general enough to apply to some of the others too. One of the questions we always, when we go for these consciousness conferences, we do ask ourselves that these theories, on one hand, they all look like they are talking about the same problem with totally different vocabulary, what might be the interrelation between them, and also at some, in some sense, they all look extremely simplistic. I might be totally wrong in that. They look extremely simplistic in what they are claiming as the basic postulates. Of course, the algorithm might be complicated, but it's as if one gets a sense they are trying to say that there is some magic sauce, and that's where consciousness comes from. And over here, our whole effort will be to try to parse the complexities or the competences at a functional level to try to say that, well, it doesn't look like there's a magic sauce. We might really have to go into the nuts and bolts of what we mean by certain kinds of complexity. Now, take for example, IIT, where integrated information is almost or literally equated to consciousness in terms of what Tononi calls this identity principle that he puts at the end of the theory. And even in earlier papers, he did try to he did explicitly say that he was associating integrated information literally to the consciousness ontologically. It was not just, he was not thinking of it as a correlate. But that part is open for debate. Different people might use it in different ways. You can use it as a measure, you can use it as a correlate, you might use it ontologically. I think both lines of investigation might be useful. The more conservative people might say that it's more like a measure, like a metric, not necessarily telling you much about the ontology, which is also fine. But one of the important things is you can take any version of integrated information, but let's talk about the current version. In the current version, there is a procedure, a rather intricate algorithmic procedure based on certain informationally and causality-oriented relations. At the end of that, the claim is that this algorithm will pick out the physical substrate of consciousness. Just to be sure, you see my mouse moving, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. So the algorithm is such that you apply to the entire brain. You're not trying to select what part of the brain might be the so-called neural substrates, the NCCs of consciousness, what might not be. The algorithm will itself pick it out. Now, of course, that would be a magnificent thing if it can do that. But this also means that they are trying to say that, well, there are certain parts of the brain which they think have a lot to do with consciousness and others don't, not. And in a way, some of the motivation for that claim comes from these studies where people said, okay, if you look at the cerebellum, cerebellar circuits are not are mostly feed forward. They are not recurrent, and we would associate for within certain psychophysical experiments, recurrent circuits have been associated to conscious awareness or conscious deliberation in the way these paradigms are set up in the lab. So one would they would make this kind of distinction, and of course the kind of, even though IIT cannot be applied to a real brain network in the version of Tononi, there are some other versions in which you could apply to larger networks. I will show one of those examples later. They would still say that, well, these physical substrates are mostly associated to thalamocortical loops, thalamocortical circuits. So they would put the whole burden of explaining where consciousness comes from these thalamocortical circuits, to the point that in the past there were these thought experiments where they said that if you take a brain and you start ablating parts of it, how much can you remove till the point that consciousness disappears? And the claim is that, well, the NCCs would be the ones that are left. You cannot take anything more or anything less. And so here I'll try to later on argue that this procedure of thinking about, even though this is not reductionist in the usual sense of reductionist, in a way there is a bit of reductionism in this process of trying to think that there are some NCCs and there are other things that are not to do much with consciousness. Of course, you can debate what one means by consciousness, but I'll try to make the argument that if you really think, try to parse complexity, this kind of argument might need to be refined. Another important theory is the global neuronal workspace, or the global workspace theory, which has gone through some iterations. Originally, it was motivated as something of an attention spotlight. In the more recent versions, they have been putting two layers to it. One is a computational layer, a global workspace, which is where everything that's outside of it is unconscious, and processes that enter within it, they sort of come to light, or they fall within the radar of consciousness. And then there's a metacognitive process, which is an attention mechanism put on top. Now, there are some interesting things about this approach also, but keep in mind that, again, this approach is a very computational approach. It's trying to say that there is a specific network module along with this extra mechanism, and all of it is just pure computation. In fact, in their paper, in the science paper by Dehan, Lau, and one more author who I unfortunately forget, they say that in fact there are two types of computation, C1, C2. One is the global information gathering, and one is this metacognitive process on top of that. And if you can replicate this as a pure algorithm, you're done. Nothing more, nothing less. Again, I'll try to argue that computational processes, as in those that you can replicate by an algorithm as a deep network, etc., might not be enough. Now, computation, in what sense I have to qualify that statement will become clear. But if it is your computational process, if it is something that you can just pinpoint to some specific spatiotemporal localization with a particular set of rules, if it is that, then you might as well just go with this information theoretic perspective, because if you have an algorithm, if you have a program which is nicely localized, all those processes are happening in one particular way, whatever be the underlying computational language one is using, so to say, you can just use your usual information metric and you're done. And you should get a measure. In a way, think about it. I like to think there are several ways you can think about information. One way to think about it is, if you take the example of transactions or trading happening in the marketplace, if you don't want to keep track of exactly the contents of the trading, but just the value, the currency that's exchanged, like money or something, that's like what information is doing. It's just keeping track of the currency that's exchanged, but not of the contents. If you think the contents are important, that metric is not enough. Then you need to think about what more might be needed. And even if you think of information from the point of view of communication theory that Shannon had originally thought, Shannon was thinking about it as in the framework of message passing. So there's one nice way to think about it. If you take a message and you ask, what's the structure of a message has a lot of structure. It has meaning, it has semantics, it has some syntax. And if you strip off all the meaning, if you strip off all the syntax, something is still left, and that's information. It's just in the bits, in the zeros and ones. So that's another interesting way to think about information. And that's already useful for a lot of processes. No doubt it is useful for neuroscience and also for brain sciences. But already from this example, you see that there's something more than information in terms of the syntax and the semantics. And in a sense, I'm alluding that there is something more generic about language that might be relevant, not only to understand messages, but in fact to understand what might be any form of intelligence or perhaps even consciousness. But that's not what I want to go into now. We can come to those parts later. Now, okay, so this is what theories of consciousness say. Let's now shift gears and go to the clinic. What do clinicians say? Clinicians don't need theories of that kind. They are not going to compute a phi and make a decision about what medical treatment to take, or even whether somebody is conscious or not. Clinicians have different scales. So we decided to look at that and even take it a little more seriously. The first obvious question is that how should we, what's the comparison between the information scales that these leading theories are claiming and what we have? The clinicians are not exactly using precisely those same scales, but they are using something that functionally might be mapped to some of those. So the very well-known work from Stephen Lauries and Adrian Owen, which is already old by now, they've probably revised this a little bit, but they gave this nice chart of thinking of consciousness as a two-dimensional thing. When they say consciousness, they're not talking about qualia again. They're just talking about consciousness in the clinic in terms of disorders of consciousness. How can you classify those? So they said that in the clinic, there are roughly two kind of metrics that are useful, two scales. One is wakefulness and one is awareness. How do you measure it in the clinic? Wakefulness refers to mostly metabolic processes, things that you would measure with a PET scan. So you put the person in a positron emission tomography scan. You're literally looking at glucose metabolism in the brain, and that's a measure of wakefulness. And furthermore, this measure of wakefulness, there are certain brain regions that are relevant for this. So wakefulness is strongly associated to the brainstem, to the pons, to all the what you'd call some of the lower brain areas. In a way, when people study sleep-wake cycles, they try and you ask yourself the question: what is the sequence of activations? How does the brain wake up? It is first the brainstem, the pons, some of these subcortical areas that first get activated, and then there's intricate circuitry by which higher areas later on wake up. It's like a blooming of a flower or something. And on the other scale, where there's awareness, again, clinicians don't think of awareness as qualia. They are only thinking of awareness in terms of what you might measure in slightly more deliberative tasks. Those can be behavioral tasks, or it can be fMRI. And this is mostly looking at thalamocortical networks. via fMRI images. So here you look at fMRI images on higher thalamocortical networks. Here you look at glucose metabolism on brainstem, pons, and some of the other lower areas. And based on that, they were able to using a lot of studies, make some generic statements about what different disorders of consciousness might look like on this scale. So within coma, you have the now glucose metabolism. There's a way to quantify that. Of course, the actual quantifications might change according to certain baselines you're using. But this image is to be taken as a relative schema. And part of what we are doing in this paper is trying to generalize this image or try to generalize this schema by adding one more dimension, such that we can also include AI into this. But okay, let's not jump that far so soon. So here, coma is is literally at the lowest levels of wakefulness and awareness, general anesthesia, and these are various stages of going from sleep to fully awake in healthy subjects. And that in a way, it's interesting to notice that because that that has a linear correlation with wakefulness and awareness, it might be one reason why people often just look. If it's linear, it means you just look at one and you can read off the other. And for that reason, you might totally ignore the wakefulness and simply put all your attention on awareness thalamocortical network and think that, well, you've gotten the metric. But obviously, when you look at disorders of consciousness, you realize that this linear relation breaks down. And even if you don't look at disorders, dreaming, for example, goes out of it. This is the vegetative state, minimally conscious state, locked-in syndrome, etc. So here is the state where you have high levels of wakefulness, but low levels of awareness. For example, Terry Schiavo and other such examples. In dreaming, you're almost at very low levels of arousal. Wakefulness is also, when I say wakefulness arousal, I'm meaning the same thing. But depending on your dream stage, you might be quite aware, and you are. And dreaming is, of course, studied in consciousness studies by a lot of people for that reason. So there is some space in this. There are sectors in this space where one studies different states that lie outside of this linear relation, and that's an argument why this one scale of awareness is not enough. In fact, this scale of awareness would be where all the current theories would pin their measures down, because they are looking at corticothalamic networks. They are thinking of consciousness in terms of these deliberative processes. It would appear that those theories are mostly, even though it's not that they were built from clinical purposes directly, but the measures of consciousness, the information metrics that the theories are trying to pinpoint, the MCCs that they are referring to, are closer to this particular scale. They don't speak of this scale because, well, this scale is less related to deliberative tasks. It's more related to, in a sense, you could say, involuntary processes. These are involuntary processes, these are voluntary processes. And in the strict psychophysical paradigm of consciousness, these are ignored. And that might be, well, there might be good reason to do that. One might try to say that you, in fact, don't need that to understand qualia. But you might also have this other argument that based on what you see in the clinic, it might be worth studying the interaction of these two mechanisms, and how can you even kind of think of them slightly more generally. Let me give one more example, which is again used by clinicians. This is work by Nicholas Schiff in Cornell, who's also been a prominent researcher in studying disorders of consciousness. And his group was one of the first to give this mesocircuit model of disorders of consciousness. So here you have the thalamocortical circuitry, the central thalamus, the cortical regions, and here you have the lower areas, the brainstem, pons, palladium, striatum, etc. And these are the red ones are inhibitory connections. The black ones are the arrows are excitatory connections. You first start igniting this area. This sets off the thalamocortical circuit, and in the healthy brain, these two areas are connected via an inhibitory connection. But in certain disorders, you can now, just in this very simplistic toy model, if you break off some of these connections, you'll quickly see that it will the lack of this inhibition here will activate this, and that will suppress the thalamus. And a subject that should be awake, the thalamus will be shut down when this particular connection is broken. So there was a nice mesocircuit way of thinking about this. Now, again, in this very mechanistic model, they are not talking about qualia, they're just talking about consciousness, the kind of supporting machinery of consciousness in humans, could be in animals also, some animals, but in humans, there's a need to understand something more than just the higher cognitive or higher computational areas you would associate with. So this is, again, of course, this is just kind of making the same case that Laurie's is making. And in a way, this is suggesting that at least for biological systems, we need to care about this additional metric. And this metric will have its own way of its own type of processes. And those processes, just to kind of set the keywords, these other set of processes, besides the computational or the cognitive, are what you might call involuntary or autonomous processes related to autonomous control systems. And this might be just a complete new branch of how to parse the complexity associated to autonomous systems, autonomous processing. In fact, just as a historical anecdote, what the early cyberneticians were studying in early cybernetics was precisely autonomous processing leading to behavior. They were also interested in computational processes, but a lot of their work was with autonomous systems, with feedback loops from the agent and environment, etc. Of course, when neural networks became fancy, that work kind of got shadowed, but now we see both those streams coming back together. Okay, so this is what we see in the clinic. Let's take one, this is again a similar meta study where people tried to, in this review, they tried to, still just a collection of various studies, they tried to say that if you look at various brain regions and they large-scale circuits, similar to what Schiff had done, but slightly more generally, not just for disorders of consciousness, but if you try to understand functionally, these are the various anatomical regions. They have some large-scale connectivity. From various studies, certain regions are related to world state, to action states, to world states, to task-specific states, to self states, etc. There's a whole intricate architecture over here where if you take every single brain region, the function that is doing, and how one function has dependencies on the other, there's a whole intricate architecture. And much of, even though this review is more recent, this kind of architectural thinking is what motivated people to build cognitive architectures, which here's an example of an architecture SOAR. I'm just giving two examples, ACT and SOAR. ACT, this one is SOAR. ACT stands for adaptive control of thought, and R for the rational. ACT is quite old by now, and probably it's a bit obsolete. SOAR stands for state, operation, action, and result, but that acronym isn't used anymore. The important thing is that these architectures were built by people who were studying cognitive robotics. And based on these motivations that they got from these kind of biologically inspired circuit, it became quickly apparent that, well, you might look at individual regions in terms of some deep network or recurrent network and even build that local functionality. But if you look at the large scale architecture, you might not just be able to just take one massive deep network and just put layers and think that it will automatically develop this functionality. So in cognitive robotics, people study cognitive architectures where they literally specify modules of functionality. Some of them are based on deep networks, and they allow these architectures, if you embody them in a robot or if you embody them in a simulation via various action perception trials, via various ways of training, it can build up certain representations in the working memory, etc. But there are a few modules that just had to be hard-coded for the system to work. For example, in the semantic memory, some declarative knowledge had to be hard-coded. In the procedural memory, some initial rules of operation had to be hard-coded. So in practical cognitive architectures, there's a kind of balance between certain modules, the functional modules that have to be hard-coded, and some where you can let the system train, learn, and develop. It's like saying that some of those things were just given via evolution, and you had to just put them in. Sure, you might play some evolutionary games and try to ask where those are acquired from, but those you just put in, and the others can be thought of as developmental processes, those that develop during maturation of an animal or something. In this case, the equivalent of development or maturation is what you would call training in the neural network or the AI world. So these architectures have been, of course, used to great success for a lot of relevant tasks. As you see, people put them in humanoid robots to perform all sorts of cognitive functionality. And there are all kinds of rather difficult tasks that a robot arm can do, where it can pick up, it can go for the grasping objects, but it also has, because of these semantic memory and semantic learning facilities that some of these modules have, it can even, to some limited extent, take some specific set of tailored instructions and do some level of very basic language processing. Of course, now that's not surprising anymore, given what's going on. But those early architectures already had some limited amount of language processing. Of course, language has some deeper kind of theoretical implications from what's going on now. But this was just the very basic symbolic level processing that these networks could do, besides some of the standard deep learning and those kind of things. So in these kind of architectures, one thing became clear, which for a cognitive scientist, it's sort of obvious. You can't just look at the brain and the body. You need the brain, body, and the environment. You need these closed loop interactions, and one has to then understand what specific mechanisms those interactions play. So in a way, now, based on some of these examples, one can ask ourselves a question that what are the homologous scales of wakefulness and awareness? At least these two things are what help us classify biological systems, biological states, maybe related to consciousness, maybe not necessarily all being conscious, but we don't know what is consciousness in artificial systems. So can we generalize these scales? Can we generalize these metrics? Now, any kind of generalization that we want to do, we'll obviously have no other choice but to do it at the level of parsing functionality by asking, what is it that the mechanisms of wakefulness are doing? What is it that the mechanisms of awareness are doing? And what is the generality of those functions that you might even expect that you might find artificial systems doing? So so wakefulness, in a way, as I mentioned before, are related to mechanisms of autonomous control. Those are, in terms of nervous system processing, they are involuntary circuits related to all sorts of things. I'm just putting self-preservation in a very general thing, but even simple things like when you're walking, your posture correction, those are anticipatory control, part of motor control mechanisms, where there's a model of the motor system that is built, that is learned in some circuitry of the cerebellum, and that gives you counterfactual and feed-forward and feedback correct signals to correct these errors, to correct your posture, etc. So in a way, wakefulness has a lot to do with what you would call autonomous processes, and part of that is related to self-controllability, in the sense to avoid being controllable by external sources. This is not about exactly sense of agency yet, but it is about at least some level. So sense of agency already goes into qualia. So we are not talking about sense of agency, but just in this case, autonomy just refers to controllability, in the sense that the agent avoids being just swayed away or being totally controlled, or its state being totally disturbed by external environmental factors. The only kind of deliberations it can do via computation are those that might be necessary for reaching its own goal states. And those deliberations, those prediction of states of the world, those might be necessary for the agent to optimize its actions. Some of those, or at least part of those, are what we would call into conscious deliberation, conscious processing. So this here, I'm not using awareness in the sense of qualia, but awareness in the clinical sense, and that would then map to computational processes, things related to learning, perception, planning, prediction. These would be autonomous control mechanisms. So one kind of way to generalize this is to say that let's look at all processes related to autonomous control. Let's look at all processes related to computation in general. Some of these examples are here. And at least on this scale, we still have to think of what the scales are. But in terms of these functionalities, one might be able to try to relate these functionalities to artificial intelligence, but also to synthetic biology and other kind of systems that you would totally inanimate systems that you would not associate any of the usual notions of consciousness to. So at least at the level of, once you understand processes and functionalities, you can compare systems in terms of their complexities and in terms of the kinds of complexities that they distribute based on the function, on the content. Rather than looking at information as a kind of universal currency, we are trying to dig a bit deeper into the content where that information might come from and parse it at least in a generic way that these systems can be compared. Of course, you can go further and say, let's literally break down exactly what autonomous processes are there and let's go deeper. You could do that, but that will kind of be an overkill, because here we want to compare a wide range of very general systems, which, I mean, if you want to compare, let's say a robot with some of the SOAR architecture with the brain of a bee or an ant or something, that comparison will have too many things that are different. If you literally go to see the exact way in which biology is performing that function and in which AI or robotics is performing that function, there are too many differences that will become a distraction. So rather than focusing on the substrate related differences, we want to focus on functionality at a generic level, or at least at the level of a process theory. So it's like saying what are the type of process theories and how can we parse complexity in terms of those processes. So, okay, so at least these might be the two homologous scales based on the clinic. We can then go and ask, what else are there on other scales? Because clinical studies are, of course, done just based on patients, mostly humans, etc. But in cognitive sciences, of course, a lot of literature on robotics, artificial systems, etc., and so on. So what other scales might be there? And I'm going to argue that there is the role of sociality. But before I do that, let me just check. There's a message here in the chat in case it's a question. Okay, I'll certainly check.
Oh yeah,
that.
no, that was just a reference for the mesocircuit hypothesis. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So so now I want to argue that besides what the clinicians are suggesting, there is one more metric. There's one more scale of complexity that is relevant, and it's not something that you can easily capture in terms of autonomous processes or computational processes. There'll be a whole lot of processes that are lying that are synergistic to these three axes that I'm going to propose. But nonetheless, this axis is relevant. You can't just get social complexity out of autonomy and computation by itself, because in a way, think about it this way. The autonomous circuitry is a circuitry within an agent. So as well for the computational circuitry. But this one will necessarily involve interactions with social conspecifics. So there are many ways to argue how sociality might be relevant. There are several papers over here, and so I'm not necessarily saying anything that is new or different. I'm just giving one simple route to it. There are a lot of papers that argue for the role of social interactions, even at right from the evolutionary scale, and a lot of those things can be studied nowadays in game theory using competition and cooperation games. So here, there's just one simple way to conceptualize this problem of what does an agent operating in a social world need to do? What does it actually do at a functional level to optimize its fitness? Again, the functional level over here is a generic level, not trying to say which neuron activates which one or which specific mesocircuit in a particular brain area might be active, but what generic functionalities are there. And one way to think about it is that it has to solve the H5W problem. The H5W problem is just an acronym for how, why, what, where, when, who. But all these questions that the agent needs to solve are all related to action. At the core of this question is that what does an agent need to do? It needs to act, but that's too generic. The one is how does it act? There's a lot of things hidden behind it. Why does it? The why of action, the how of action will in fact. So if you say how should it act, in order to answer how should it act, it has to first ask why should it act, or rather what are the motivations, what are the goals, what are the drives, what are the needs. These can be in synthetic systems. There's a whole lot of ways in which you can encode these goals or these drives or needs via homeostatic mechanisms. And there's a whole lot of studies by Pierre Odier and others who are studying motivation, intrinsic motivation, and its relation to goal-oriented action. So when the agent has to ask how to act, it first has to find the motivation related to certain goals, drives. It has to solve certain spatial it has to solve certain spatial issues related to action. It has to decide what are the objects that are involved in the action at hand. The motivation is coming from here, but here it has to kind of have a representation. You can think about this as mental representations or mental states of these objects. It has to solve certain spatial determine some spatial properties related to the objects that it is motivated to act on for some specific reason. It has to determine a sequence of timing. This might be related to some kind of planning, decision making, and representation of these of mental states related to objects in the world based on the motivation it has. And finally, it has to solve the who problem, the who of action, as in all these things before up to this stage could simply work well if you had a world where there were only inanimate things. It's just the agent and the world and no other conspecifics. But once it comes to when you fill an agent in a social world with its conspecifics, it has to do this very difficult task of estimating the mental states of other agents. But it's never going to succeed in doing that fully. Now, with these other tasks, it might still be some level of computation or cognition, where you might say that, well, you learn the dynamics of the world, you have some world model, like you see, you see a ball rolling, you have some sense of persistence. You might still do these other things in terms of some cognitive / computational way. But when it comes to estimating the mental states of other agents, those are hidden. You're never going to get. You're working on a problem with incomplete data at the get-go. There's no way you're going to build an actual realistic dynamical model. So this is the part where these psychological states, theory of mind, theory of the other, model of the other, all those things become relevant for this last part of the problem. In a way, you can think of everything else on top as some kind of world model or physics engine. I'll tell you later why I'm using the word physics engine, and you can think of this as the psychological engine. These are the two modules. And this particular, the who of action is strongly suggesting that to make these inferences of hidden mental states. Now, mind you, when I say make inferences, we are not saying that the agent even has to be right in making these inferences, but it needs to make some inference based on that, plan its action, get feedback from the world, and based on that, improve its model of the other agent. Now, if it's really bad, it will just die out because it will just misjudge, and the other agent might be a predator, who knows. And of course, it'll die out, or evolution will wipe it out, whichever mechanism you use. But it has to have some mechanism to make these inferences, and then based on feedback, based on learning, based on experience, etc., it has to build mental models of other agents. You could think of this as the theory of mind part, if you like. And all of this comes from various cooperation competition games. So people study a lot of this in a very simplified game theoretic context. But all of that work is strongly pointing to sociality as a driver of consciousness at the evolutionary level. And one might even try to mimic these multi-agent systems. I'll mention one example later. You can have in Minecraft or in this those kind of virtual reality settings, you might have multi-agent systems where you have various kind of social interactions, and you'll quickly see that all sorts of social norms, social strategies evolve. So some of this work related to game theory and social interactions, the original work came from the book of David Lewis, Conventions. And that again is not about consciousness. They are literally trying to say that in these, if you study these games at the level of evolutionary game theory, at the level of cooperation, competition, all sorts of interesting strategies developed by agents. And one of the kind of things we are suggesting in this work is that presumably some of those winning strategies got encoded into as anatomical mechanisms, such as emotional reflexes, like the flight or fight response. So early on in evolution, these things just were by trial and error. There was some natural selection, and some of these got encoded. And of course, there's a whole part of emotion that is related to qualia, but here I'm not referring to qualia again. I'm just referring to emotional reflexes in the chemical sense and how it might be hardwired as an anatomical mechanism following these game theoretic scenarios that might have taken place at an evolutionary scale. Some of these also might happen at a developmental scale, not the flight or fright response, but a whole, you can think of development as a mini game theoretic version of evolution. And there are all kinds of specific paradigms that people study. So the argument we're trying to make here is that a taxonomy ought to include social complexity. Now, social complexity might be a little harder to quantify, so we have to specify what exactly does that mean. So one way we can put it is in the following way. Since we already tried to label these three kind of complexity kinds, autonomic, computational, and social, in order to kind of think about what the possible metrics might be, let's just think about what are the objects we are talking about. In each of these complexities, what would be the relevant parts, the building blocks, what would be the whole, the system level realizations, and what might be phenomena that emerge or result from those. So in terms of autonomic systems, you might work with sensors, actuators, could be more related to your motor system, biological, artificial, etc. The systems level realization might be, well, robots, autonomous nervous systems, prokaryotes, and the emergent phenomena we are referring to here is self-regulated real-time behavior, essentially. The things that cyberneticians were studying, the things that you might study even in motor control, removing any reference to deliberate action, etc., involuntary reflexes, etc. At the computational level, we are taking this again very generally. The paths would be neurons, transistors. The systems level realization could be, in fact, neural networks of brains. It could be microprocessors. It could be cognitive systems like the artificial cognitive architectures. And the higher level capabilities or the functionality that results are general problem solving capabilities. Those might be specific, those might be general. We might have to argue how far this goes. This doesn't mean, here I'm referring to domain specific capabilities, just to keep things a little bit more narrow. Otherwise, it can be slightly broader interpretations to that. Now, so okay, those at least we have some conception in terms of autonomous control mechanisms, neural networks, etc. How do we think of the social level? So at the social level, these are at the individual level. There is no other. There might be other ways to think of it, but that's some kind of most practical compared to how these metrics work. At the social level, an individual agent is the other parts. A population of the same kind of agent or an organization would be the whole. So a given species or a given social structure, etc. And the emergent phenomena that we might refer to might be certain conventions, signaling conventions that emerge, norms, cultures. You might think of slightly higher level things like language, etc. But maybe you can just focus on social norms, culture, signaling conventions. These are things that are highly studied in cognitive sciences, and literally these are the things that you study via evolutionary games. So what we are trying to say here, I should just make one emphasis. It might look strange why we are referring to this level at the level of a population, and if so, how does that kind of have something to say with these two levels, which are referring to an individual agent? After all, we are still talking about consciousness of an agent. What we are, in a way, the what this might come down to saying is that if there was an agent, an isolated agent in the world who had, I'm again not talking at the developmental scale because a lot of things are hardwired, but at the evolutionary scale, if there was only a single agent and there were no social interactions, one could argue that this agent might not develop any form of consciousness even. So in a way, sociality is like a top-down driver. It's working in some sense. It's working, if you like, you might think of it as a downward causation, whereas these things are like bottom-up processes, upward causations. They're kind of imminent causes. This is a causation that is coming at the top-down level, an evolutionary pressure, so to say. And what we'll try to quantify this measure at the level of the population, but in order to talk about, we are still talking about a single agent. So a single agent doesn't mean a human like me or you. When we say human, we talk about one agent, a typical human. And so in our kind of structure, in the space that we build, we'll have human as one entity, a bee as an entity, and ant as an entity, a deep neural network. So in that sense, this might not exactly be at this point very useful to talk about the consciousness of one patient versus another patient or one subject versus another, but a human compared to some other agent. And therefore, this whole comparison will be at the level of a conspecific. It could be a whatever the species or whatever the type could be. It could be a family of deep networks interacting with each other, etc. Okay, and the type of complexity measures that we'll refer to, there are a whole bunch of those, but the type that will be very generally useful will be what are called the whole versus parts type of measures, where you're looking at information at the level of the substrate, which is the systems level, the whole, and its parts. In theories like IIT, this is famously used in the sense where this is the whole brain, and here you break it up into two parts, or you divide it into left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and then you try to ask, does the system do anything more than the sum of its parts? And informationally, can we capture and quantify the whole over and above what happens as a sum of its parts? And if anything is left, that is either that is some form of complexity, and in a specific version of the theory, they refer to it as integrated information. But generally speaking, these whole versus parts measures will make sense here, because even at a functional level, we are still asking the question that all these parts, they are all having some very specific functionality, but when they come together with their various functions, they give rise to some of these emergent or these collective, let's say collective behaviors that are not directly explainable just at the level of the parts. You still have to put the parts together in a clever way. Not necessarily that all of this is emergent in the strong sense of emergence, but there is some clever mechanics or clever strategies by which the parts come together to give rise to the whole, such that it is doing something more than simply adding the parts at the functionality of the parts at an information level. Now, I mean, we are not, as I said, since we are keeping the functionalities general, we can only compare them at the level of complexity, and information theory gives you a whole bunch of nice ways to compare complexity. But unlike what the consciousness theories are doing, where they are looking at information as one thing for the whole brain or parts of it, and then hoping that IIT picks up the NCCs and nothing else, here, what we are saying is, what's important is to take the message from the clinicians and the cognitive scientists a little more seriously, and not think of NCCs as something exclusive. They might well be there for certain important processes, but for the functionality that we are referring, all the functionalities that we associate to consciousness, we might have to take into account all these types of processes, their complexities, and most important, how they might come together. So for that, we might not be able to put one information metric, but we might have to pass some of these generic functionalities and apply information in a kind of sensible, as if you're opening the black box. You're saying, okay, these are a categorization of the functionalities, and I'm associating complexity to specific generic classes or categories of functionalities rather than the whole brain by itself. So that's the message. So as a next step, the obvious thing I have to tell you is, okay, let's see some actual examples of what metrics people have used, what might be useful. Before I do that, let me again check this interesting comment here. by Adam. Okay, let me come to this later, Adam. I think it's something that might require a little more thought. So let me answer this. The shorter ones I'm happy to take now. The longer ones I can put later. Okay, so what I just said schematically shown here, just to give you a visual of what are the paths, what are the whole, what type of interactions. We don't know what the interactions are. Those are something that will depend case by case. But at least what happens is when you look at functionality in general categories, information theory at least allows you to ignore certain substrate related specific dynamics and make generic statements about what currencies exchange within that category of functions. So, well, we should still do better than information. And at the end of the paper, I'll argue that whatever we are saying might be helpful, but it's not enough. We'd have to go more. We'll have to ask for structures beyond just information. But anyway, let me get to that. And here's for the example for computation. Here, I'm just giving the example of the social organization of an ant colony, where you have or rather the bee colony, where you have the queen bee, you have the worker bee, and you have various soldier bee, etc. And you have you have a social strata over there. And one might just study bees or ants, etc. And the various kind of social strategies that they have evolved. Some of them is also used for what people call as collective intelligence, etc. So these collective intelligence measures are used, in fact, in some of these contexts. And what we are talking about is not very far from those. So here's just an example, a list of examples of actual measures that people use. Again, I will focus on this whole versus parts, which is close to IIT and integrated information as a specific example. But I should just point out that besides IIT type of measures, people have used a whole bunch of other measures. Many of those you might say have certain limitations, that a lot of them are psychometric, like this collective intelligence factor is a psychometric measure compared to these integrated information measures, which are actually capturing the dynamics and the topology of the interaction. So they are telling you a little bit more than a psychometric measure. But nonetheless, there are other measures like synergistic information and mutual information, which people use for and transfer information for very specific procedure. A few of those I'll actually tell you about when we come to a specific case study. For now, I'm focusing on IIT because even if you don't take the theory as something that is that you might believe or that you might take seriously at the ontological level, it still is really a nice framework at a very procedural or operational level in terms of what might be a nice correlate, a nice measure for assessing some states of consciousness in very specific ways. As you know, again, the current and even the past algorithms of IIT have been expressed in such a way that you might apply them to some discrete logic gates, but it wasn't clear, at least from the original proponents of the theory, how exactly you might apply it for a realistic system or even for a large network. In the latest version of IIT, which is now IIT 4.0, as you know, they've been kind of doing some iPhone type release. There was a IIT 1, IIT 2, 3, 4. It's just that they are kind of extending the theory, adding some more postulates, putting some more detail to the algorithm. Maybe that's a good thing, but in a way, even in the latest version, you cannot really use that algorithm for anything more than some 8 or 16 logic gates, and also it's working with logic gates, so it's just looking at on-off states. So we wanted to look at something that looks at a network, not of logic gates, but at some network like the connectome network. So, for example, the type of network that we are interested in, and not just we, but I guess all of you, this is the colors are fake, but the image is real. It's a connectome network of Hagman, Spohns, and others, which is basically axonal white matter connectivity at the level taken by diffusion tensor imaging. And this particular network, now there are more improvised data sets on the HPP websites and others of way higher resolution data than this. But this particular network had 999 ROIs, regions of interest. So it was if you present a connectivity matrix as I've done, it's a 1000 by 1000 matrix. Most of the connections, as you see, are short distance ones, and they are a few sparse long-range connections, and the actual imaging picture with the coloring added later on looks like this. And we kind of wanted to ask ourselves a question in this early study, that for a network like this, we have this is the actual structure of the brain at the large scale level. It's not a complete detailed structure. So it's of course ignoring gray matter and some detailed cortical circuitry. So it's still missing a lot. Okay, we agree. It's still missing a lot, but nonetheless, compared to working with a handful of logic gates, is there any way we could extend the IIT measure to work on something like this? And also these kind of systems, there are all kinds of in computational neuroscience. We have all these firing rate models, Wilson-Cohen models. I'm not talking the spiking neuron model. I'm talking more at the level of firing rate. So you might take the membrane potential and look at it as an analog signal rather than a digital one. And they are additionally stochastic. So the IIT algorithm was based on non-stochastic processes. So how do we include some stochasticity? How do we include analog states which go not at 0 and 1, but maybe between 0 and 1 or -1 and +1? And how do we include some kind of realistic models? So we set about doing that. There was early work by Barnett and Seth that also was inspired by the same problem, but they did not get to applying it to the large scale connectome network. So that was what we wanted to do, and that is actually the work that we did in this particular paper you see in 2016. As a kind of short way to just give you an intro into it. First, we took a toy model of a simple network. This is just a network with some fixed given weights. All the weights are the same for simplicity. This is a toy model, and on this model we allowed for linear stochastic dynamics. So Gaussian noise, linear dynamics. Linear dynamics means based on the current state vector, you have the connectivity matrix. The next state vector is just an update of that. The simplest dynamics you can put. Now, this simplest dynamics is of course not how the brain works. The realistic dynamics in any Wilson-Cohen model or the model that people like Gustavo Teco and others are building, those all have these nonlinear activation functions, a logistic function, or what have you. But you might still argue that if you take those realistic Wilson-Cohen type of firing rate models and you look at them close to the attractor, near the attractor, all nonlinear systems, as is well known, can be approximated via linear dynamical systems. So linear dynamics is still a good approximation so long as you're close to the parameters that the dynamics is operating near some attractor point. Now, of course, in a nonlinear system, you have a whole bunch of attractor points from the resting state to various task states. So you have to fix the parameters carefully. But here we are not going to talk about a particular specific attractor. I'm just trying to say that with a simplistic linear dynamics, which could mimic something at the vicinity, the spatiotemporal dynamics of the brain at the vicinity of the attractor, how far can you get applying an IIT type of measure? So as a simulation of this network with linear dynamics, you might think that you start with some initial conditions, and because there are no external inputs, eventually the oscillations will go close to 0, but because of the noise, it will never actually die down to 0. There will be some stochastic signal. So this might be, and of course, if you put an impulse, then the signal might stay steady at some level, like the resting state brain or something like this. So this would be how typical signals from an fMRI type of measurement might look like. So for a network like this, if you have dynamics like this, what can you compute in terms of the celebrated phi measure of IIT, and then how can you do it for this type of network? So in the IIT papers, as I said, never mind the notation now. I'll just give you the intuition of what this measure of what IIT intended and how you like the work we are showing. There are of course various approximate measures that people call approximate IIT measures. You could call everything an approximate measure in some sense, but the particular measure we are working with is interesting not because it's an approximation. It might well be one compared to IIT if you think of IIT as a ground truth. But it's interesting because we are able to actually push it enough in these type of dynamics to get actual analytic results for simple networks and numeric results for small ones. So just to summarize, in the IIT framework, the whole versus parts goes like this. You have some system, you allow it to do some dynamical stuff. It goes from one state to another from at an initial time T0 to T1. So in IIT, you're just looking at a one state transition. It's one system from, it just makes one transition. And in this transition, you're looking at, given that there's noise, there is of course some kind of probability of what the vector of these states will be. And given that stochasticity, you could compute an entropy. And entropy is what people think of as average information. So once you have such a stochastic dynamical system, you can have various notions of entropy related to this. The specific notion of information that IIT was interested in, and this is how Tononi's paper even formulated it, that they are looking at the information generated by the network as a whole during a single state transitions due to its causal interactions, over and above that, generated independently by its parts. So in IIT, what they do is they take the network as a whole, they compute its conditional entropy, conditional because they only want to see the entropy during a jump from one state to the other. Then they partition the system into two parts, and they look at the individual parts, and then again they look at each part and try to see how that part behaves when it jumps from that one state to another, and during that they compute the conditional entropy. And then of course in IIT there's the whole business of how do you make the selection of these parts, and that is another computational problem. How do you do that? So what we did is, in this work, because we are working with this well-defined, relatively simple linear dynamics, we wrote down these equations. I'm not going to the derivation here, but the end result is that you can, if you push through the math a little bit for these type of relatively simple systems, you can actually get analytic results for this quantity, meaning that phi can be completely expressible in terms of the covariance matrix. Now, in a way, that might not be too surprising. So it's not proportional. It's actually the log of the determinant of the covariance matrix. But the important thing is that all of this then just depends on the covariance matrix. Now, intuitively, if you think about it, that's not too surprising, because what we have here is linear Gaussian dynamics. So if you take a Gaussian time series signal, besides the mean, which is a baseline adjust that you might do, the mean is just the baseline of the signal, that kind of can factor out. That's not the most important here, given that it's a linear system. The only other moment that is there in this signal, or the only other statistical moment, is the covariance, because in Gaussian signals or in Gaussian time series systems, all higher moments, like the correlation is the kind of 2-point correlation. The 3-point correlation, the 3 points one would vanish, but the 4 points, the 6 points, the 8 point, they all depend on the covariance, which is a 2-point function, so to say. So the covariance is really all, the mean and the covariance is everything there is to know about a Gaussian system. And in that sense, the conditional covariance matrix and its eigenvalues are what then this measure captures. So of course, in later works, we went deeper into looking at these eigenvalues of the conditional covariance, and those are interesting because if you think about this network like a musical orchestra, and you literally think of music as a time series signal, and you compute covariances between its various parts, and then you take the eigenvalues of that covariance matrix that is computed, those really correspond to the principal modes. The principal component modes that you typically use in these time series analysis are related to the eigenvalues of the covariance matrix. So this information measure is literally tapping onto some of those things. And here in this work, we could do that analytically for this measure, for these simple systems. And in the end, we could get phi as a function of the weights of the network. So for larger networks like this, doing it analytically was a little of a pointless exercise. In principle, it's possible, but we just proceeded to do it numerically, and I'll show you the result. What we did over here is we took the Hagman network as is, as you see on top, and here we took a randomized version of it. And then we applied this measure. When I say numerically, it just means that we did not resort to the exact values of the functional expressions, but based on some connectivity strength, here we took G as a global scaling of this anatomical network, a global scaling measure. that people use even in realistic mean field type of dynamical models. And based on this global scaling, we asked, okay, how does the actual phi values as a function of this global scaling compare for the real connectivity versus a randomized connectivity for the same linear dynamics? And what we see is that at very low coupling, of course, there's almost no difference. But as the coupling gets into some range, the actual phi measure starts growing significantly more than the randomized version. And at some point, the phi can get really high up to the point that the network becomes unstable. And of course, this result you should only take qualitatively, because I've already mentioned that unless we don't do this for realistic mean field dynamics with all the nonlinearities in place, this cannot be taken too seriously. But here is a way of computing phi, or at least the phi in terms of this definition that was there in the earlier version of the paper without all this extra compositioning that the later version does. One might be able to do that, but this is actually the essence of the measure. And what you notice is that phi can get really high values when you come close to the critical point. And this is, though here we are not talking about critical systems or criticality, this message that you hear that the brain might be operating at the threshold or at the edge of criticality, not at criticality, but at the operating point of the global operating point of the couplings of the brain are such that it sits just near the edge of criticality, as if it is in readiness to act when it needs to for some task. And in a nonlinear system, what happens is, unlike a linear system, after the critical point, a linear system just becomes unstable. But that's the beauty of a nonlinear dynamical system. After one critical point, there's a regime of the next phase, and it can go to another state, like from the rest to task, etc. So in a realistic nonlinear dynamics, this calculation might be more interesting. And that is something one can think of as further work. Another thing one can do is, given this network connectivity and dynamics that one is using, one can start creating artificial lesions or lesions based on realistic brain damages and start asking how phi compares on these measures. So here's a practical way to actually compute phi for the type of systems we are interested in. So unlike the formulation of the literal formulation of these whole versus parts measures in the IIT papers, there are now other ways in which they can be actually used for interesting clinical applications. So this is one way in which this measure could be applied. Now, doing this, what we will think about in our construction of the morphospace, we have these three axes. We want to use this whole versus parts measure by parsing a system at its functional level, looking at the functional modules related to those circuits, and then computing this whole versus parts at that level. So if you did that, then for each species, you will get some value on this space. Now, just as a word of warning, before I go into qualitative details about this particular picture is not a qualitative. It's not a quantitative result. As in for reasons I'll mention, we did not actually take each of these species like birds, cephaloids, ants, etc., and actually perform each of these computations. We couldn't really do that for reasons that I'll mention. But what we did is, based on these type of complexity measures, which are really grounded in what kind of functionalities one associates, we did a kind of relative schematization of let's say, if a human sits here at one end of the scale with some competence in autonomous complexity, computational complexity, social complexity, relative to that human, or relative to someone that's very low on the scale, like a coma patient, or the kind of scaling that we already know from Laurie's and Owens's work, where would other animals or other agents fit relative to these things? So what we did is, just based on relative functionality and competences, and also taking into account how domain specific or how general those functions are, we try to scale where various systems might be. So as an example, if we first talk about, let's say, AI systems, typically, as they are right now, they are not having much autonomous functionality. Some of them do, some of them like social robots, etc. But others like Siri, Watson, deep neural networks, they are mostly going very high, and currently might be even more than humans in the computational axis. The only kind of caveat to be careful about there is that you have to also take into account not just the fact that some computational processing might be superseding humans in a particular domain, but also how broad the functionality of that of the domains where those computations can be done. So taking all those into account, AI will go very strong on this scale. It might, as you see, this was pre-ChatGPT. You might now start correcting this a bit more. But anyway, we at least tried to address where things like AlphaGo, multi-agent deep networks, etc. would be. And on this scale, this is an interesting one. If you think about it, in cognitive neuroscience, you hear about it less, but in the synthetic biology and artificial life literature, like there we have artificial intelligence, there's also the whole kind of long-standing field of artificial life. People are building all kinds of synthetic elements from biological to others. Like one nice example is of a recent work which we reference in our paper, in which what they did in the lab is, instead of building, so they took they took the DNA of some, I believe some bacterium, and instead of working with the 4 bases, the ATGC, the universal bases, they added 2 more artificially, and they built a DNA, or rather an RNA with 6 bases, and put that in an organism and try to, of course, they had to modify quite a bit of its structure to see what kind of within a given environment it could even sustain itself for some limited amount of time with some kind of help. So there's a whole lot of work in the synthetic biology field where they are really developing, you might think, on this autonomous axis, where they are looking for mechanisms close to life or wakefulness or arousal, as you might say, self-sustaining, self-preservation mechanisms by which you have an organism within an environment based on chemotaxis or other sensory interactions that it can have in the environment. It learns to find the resources necessary to sustain itself. That might happen at the level of a single cell, or it might even happen at the level of a small synthetic system. So there's a whole bunch of such things that are studied on this scale. And also, of course, there's a natural systems like bacterium and C. elegans, where you might put somewhere on this scale. Then going a little further with the higher animals. Now, of course, these don't have that much of social interactions to some level. But as you get into higher animals, bees, ants, cephaloids, birds, etc., you see more and more types of complex social behaviors, and these have been studied quite a bit. Again, this scale is relative, so you might change the positions here and there. They might, as we learn more about all these animal studies, you might place these things a little bit differently. That's a possibility, and we might also try to do some more realistic quantitative studies on this, which I'll mention how they might be done, even though we haven't done that. But doing all these placements, what we notice is that, well, AI as we know it mostly goes along this axis. Synthetic life systems, artificial life, goes along these axes, and biological systems seem to have an interesting trajectory where they start here and then they kind of take a kind of they curve around here, and then they seem to be going like this. Now, what can we qualitatively say from this? Why is it? I mean, one of the things is that why is it that we didn't have a kind of more even spread around some central region or some kind of nucleus around the space? Why is it seem to be veering around the side and going in this way? What would it take for evolution to go from the 0 point to something like this and go here, rather than taking this turn? We don't have a complete answer, but I can give one kind of suggestive reason why that may be. If you as an analogy, if you look at these things that people call predator-prey systems, which are studied in evolutionary theory, you might also look at some gene regulatory systems where you have a excitatory and suppressor gene, and you have or rather a network of 3 genes, and you have oscillations. when you have any of these, some of these interesting nonlinear systems with particular kind of predatory and preying of resources kind of mechanism, you have oscillations. And what oscillations means is that if one of the entities goes too far, it will soon suffer it will soon suffer the fact that its resources gets limited because the other entity is low. And because of those oscillations in a scale of resources, the kind of evolutionary track would be more like a cycle. These are what people in nonlinear systems theory, they study these limit cycles. And when you have something, or when you have two agents or two things oscillating in time, if you plot them in terms of the population of one agent versus the population of another, those oscillations will turn out to be cyclic trajectories. And here we kind of see some indication of a cyclic trajectory, suggesting that there might be a predator-prey-like type of oscillatory dynamics at the level of complexity. So if you wanted to build a kind of mathematical toy model of either evolution or of these systems like this, it would be something where you're basing it as complexity as the variables, and then based on that, you try kind of study how the dynamics of complexity itself, and at various points, you might identify functionalities that correspond to some animals or the other. So that's one kind of qualitative explanation we have, but and that is something that one might be able to study by a toy model. But one of the other features that came out of the studies, when we tried to do this, we looked a little bit more into various. So one thing that prominently struck out of this was we looked at Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. In the psychology literature, this is quite well known. And of course, he doesn't talk of complexity or he doesn't talk of consciousness, but he says that there are intelligence is not one thing. There are multiple kinds of intelligences, and he kind of gave some 8 or 11 types. And first, I'll just mention the types, and then I'll try to tell you why I'm separating them into these things. So there's a whole bunch of intelligences from kinesthetic, spatial, adaptive, logical, reasoning, interpersonal, introspective, etc. What occurred to us is that if we look at these and we asked ourselves a question, what type of complexity classes can you place these intelligences in? It became obvious that, in fact, there's a kind of categorization where some of these are related to autonomous complexity or intelligences that come from mechanisms related to autonomous systems, some that are related to mechanisms coming from computational processes, and others are intelligences that we would associate to social functionalities or facilities related to that. So in a way, all of Gardner's intelligences can literally be placed on either one or a combination of these scales. Nothing is outside it. So in a way that was just circumstantial evidence for saying that at least what we are doing here is capturing some of those. Was there a question? Okay, so I just heard some sound, so never mind. So now, on one hand, this is just a kind of superficial comparison that, well, we try to build these complexity classes, of course, motivated by consciousness, but nothing about consciousness went into these complexity classes except for the clinical studies. All that went into it is various functionalities. Now, many of these functionalities are associated to some form of intelligence. So it's not so surprising that some way of classifying intelligence might in fact be, or rather it might be that what we are doing here is just classifying intelligences in terms of their complexities, functional complexity, and nothing more. But it also begs the question, if that is the case, is it that consciousness is some kind of synergy of these three kinds of intelligences? I mean, it might well be a synergy of these kind of complexities, but is consciousness just a higher or a synergistic form of intelligence? Or is intelligence what comes on top of all the mechanisms of consciousness? This is not a debate we can settle now. But if we are to go qualitatively this kind of taxonomy seems to suggest the first. Rather than intelligence as being something that arises from consciousness, this seems to suggest the other way around, that what we call consciousness might be some kind of synergy between intelligences. It might itself be some form of higher intelligence. How exactly these synergies come, what the mechanisms are, that we might not fully understand. And I would even go so far to argue that if we just stick to complexity and in terms of information theoretic things that we have gone so far, we are still missing something. And that is why I was alluding that there's something more than information. So that makes the case that we have to go beyond this picture. But nonetheless, at least at this point, this is just, the suggestion seems to be coming that indeed consciousness is sitting as some form of higher intelligence. Now, let me point to some, if that is the case, then I should obviously say a little bit more about AGI and some of these things related to artificial general intelligence. So let me point to two studies that say that might either be used as evidence or that say something useful related. So this is a well-known paper from not too long ago by a group of Josh Tenenbaum at MIT and Gershon at Harvard, building machines that learn and think like people. This is a rather well-known paper that came out. Again, this is a pre-Chat GPT paper. So in a way, it's good that they at least added this qualifier like people. Otherwise, a lot of what they are saying would only apply to machines. But it's rather a paper in which they took into account the cognitive science literature very seriously. What is the main message I want to pull from this? So one of the things they suggest over there is that model building is really the hallmark of human level learning or human level learning and reasoning, and what for any form of human level learning, reasoning, thinking, whatever you say, it has to come from building models. The agent has to build models that are causal models of the world, and for that they propose an architecture that consists in a way of three parts. Two parts of the architecture are startup engines, like they are priors, literally priors. And one is a hierarchical Bayesian network, like the deep learning network. So in this work of Tenenbaum, what they said is that the three parts of the architecture, one is an intuitive physics engine, the physics module. One is an intuitive psychology engine. These two have to come hardwired. They just have to be there. They might have evolved evolutionarily, but at the developmental scale, you're not going to wait till the baby acquires this. The engines are there. It might just prune the parameters and tune it further. And the third thing is the Bayesian network, which would be like the deep learning networks, perhaps used for some computational tasks. So what they try to argue is that the physics engine is related to learning, to kind of specifying models of the world based on some priors that enable notions of persistence, continuity, object cohesion, etc. The psychology engine is one that's associated to or enables agency, distinction of animate from inanimate, social constraints, the ability to act contingently and reciprocally with other agents, etc. So mental states, if you like to say, theory of mind, mental states, everything would come here. Involuntary reflexes, everything would come here. And in the third part of the module, the hierarchical Bayesian network, this would be where you might have some deep learning processes for deliberate computations, perceptions, everything that would come in the typical paradigm, psychophysical paradigms of conscious awareness or conscious reporting or deliberation, etc. And an interesting statement that the paper made is that it is unclear whether a complete representation of this psychology engine would ever come from deep learning networks which work on a purely predictive way, because this psychology engine has to work contingently. There is no way you can just work on predictions that are made by, let's say, deliberative processes, etc. There might be all kinds of things can happen where there might not be enough time to sit training and learning in the usual way. So they try to suggest that something about this part is not going to come from your hierarchical computational mechanisms. Now, if you look closer, this architecture, in a way, is not very far from this way of looking at it, is not very far from the type of the kind of complexity parsing we are doing. This would literally refer to the autonomous processing, the autonomous complexity. This would in fact refer to the social axis, maybe not completely. It would have some, these things overlap, they interact, that's for certain, but this could be closer identified with the social axis, and the usual Bayesian networks which are used for standard computation and prediction might be something you would map to the computational complexity or to the computational axis. So the architecture here seems to also, or rather this work came out first, and it's much more prominent than what we are saying. But in a way, I would say that this kind of architectural suggestion seems to provide some circumstantial evidence in favor of parsing complexity in the three axes that we have done, not more, not less. And another relevant way of looking at this is that, in some sense, if you think about this, this is a slightly older work I'm referring to. I'll tell you in a minute why I'm referring to this. In a sense, you can think about this very loosely. These three axes you might also think of as mind, body, environment, but you should not take that part very literally. The mapping to psychology, physics, and computation is a little closer. The important thing here is that the social part is not just the world, it's the world and other agents. So if you add that qualifier, then this is literally bodily facility functionalities, mental states in terms of deliberative processes, and here everything that involves interaction with other agents, etc. So this kind of dichotomy suggests that you really need to take very seriously the interactions between these three objects, as opposed to what current consciousness theories are doing, where they are looking at some subset of the brain or some specific part and ignoring everything else. You might do that for I'm not saying it's wrong, but for a more general setup where you want to compare intelligences or maybe some level of what you might call functionality related to consciousness, you might need to study those interactions more seriously. And why I'm pointing out this work of Randall Beer and Paul Williams, this is a work 2014. There in the title, among other things, they are talking about minimally cognitive agents. And what they do, this is a pretty interesting, rather impressive work. It's a very simple toy model where they study a simple system in a simulation. Here it has some 8 sensors, 3 interneurons, or the brain. This is the body. Here there are 2 motor neurons, and then there are actual motors associated with the motor neurons. So if the motor neuron goes beyond some state, it can activate the motor system, and the agent can move left or right. So this agent can only move left or right. Here they are sensors, and this is in a XY, in a 2-dimensional plane. This agent has to learn to play a game. So let me first just give you the setup of what this system is. Then I mention the functions that it's doing. So the model behind this is a very simple one. It's not motivated from the usual artificial neurons and backpropagation, but it is motivated from what people typically use in continuous time recurrent networks, the type of firing rate models that you use in a standard neuroscience context. The equations that are related to the neurons of the agent are just the usual, the firing rate neurons. So here's some weight matrix related to the neurons. There's an activation function, and there's an initial inputs coming from the sensors. The sensors are giving some, so in this case, the sensors are just object sensors. They could be ordinary sensors, nothing fancy about those. They detect when an object is in the vicinity of that particular sensor based on intensity or some standard metric. And the neurons will take into account that as an input signal, and the usual logistic function is the activation function for this firing rate model. You might think of this as a typical mean field type of model. But what is interesting is that here there are only 3 brain neurons, 2 motor neurons. So it's a organism of 5 neurons, and the output of the motor neurons will then be relayed to the motor system to say what value of the x-axis the agent can move. So the agent can move left or right, nowhere else. And the agent is a simulated agent. What they do in the setup is there is an object that is falling on top, and the agent has to learn to. They taught it several things. Either has to learn to catch the object, or in a slightly more complicated task, they use the cue object and a probe object. It has to ignore the cue, but it has to catch the probe. And what they do, of course, I mean, it's not like there's a magic sauce in this, but it's an interesting model which involves just 5 neurons, the typical kind of model equations you'd use in any standard computational neuroscience textbook. There are some 46 free parameters. And what they do is that they have not one agent, they have a whole ensemble of many agents, and this object itself can have variable sizes. So they run this through an evolutionary algorithm. These evolutionary algorithms go in such a way that you expose several of these agents to play this game on a whole variable set of objects, and after a number of trials, you try to assess the fitness, which agents have played the game better and not. And the ones that haven't, you just kill them off. The ones that have, you keep those. And there is some random mutation on the weights. So there's some random update on the weights. So you keep doing this random update on the weights, like a mutation on the weights, and you allow this evolutionary filtering. And after many generations, these agents learn to play this game. So on one hand, this is fascinating by itself. People might not be so surprised because, well, deep learning networks do a whole bunch of more complicated things. But what's interesting is that here they manage a rather interesting task with just 5 neurons. What is this? Okay. Right. So they manage a rather interesting task with just 5 neurons by using a type of neural network that is closer to what people use in neuroscience. These are analog neurons with recurrent connections. And what is important is they also, in this kind of game, obviously the agent is taking feedback. There is a kind of sort of, it's not a direct feedback, it's not interacting with another agent, but there is a external source via which is part of the analysis. So what do we actually do in this paper? I mean, the fact that such games can be learned, by now that is not so surprising. So what happens typically in these type of games is that after many runs, the agents that have kind of the network is pruned sufficiently enough, they learn various strategies. So in case of so one strategy could be that it completely ignored the cue task and it only moved when the probe task comes. Another strategy might be that it actually used the information of the cue task to locate itself and then just relax because the probe will come in the same place. So there are all kinds of strategies that these agents learn on their own via these tuning of weights. So something interesting is going on within neural networks in terms of such intelligent behavior. But here, what's interesting is that it's a small network. But what's even more interesting is the kind of analysis that these kind of models allow you to do compared to deep learning networks. So what they did in this paper is that because there is some stochasticity in not only the cues that are thrown, the size of this probe, but also a little bit in the weights, etc., there is some probability distributions involved of what the objects in the world are and what the agent is having. So what Beer and Williams did is they computed all sorts of information measures to literally trace the information flow from the cue to the sensors, to the interneurons, to the motors, to the action of the agent. So they, for example, computed the synergistic information between the sensors and the motor and the interneurons and the motor neurons. They try to basically ask the question, which combination of neurons or which part of the circuit stores the information of the cue size? Which part of the circuit stores the information of the cue location? What is the synergy between the queue and the body. So all that, they literally kind of parsed via using various information measures by opening it out. Now, if you just apply IIT like a black box for the whole thing, you're not going to see all that. So they really parsed the functionality and applied this. Now, why this is interesting, that imagine doing that for something where you took agents like this and you set up a multi-agent scenario with these agents, and then you started parsing information in the way they do, but by taking into account the three complexities we are stating. And then one of the kind of questions you can very specifically ask is, in the same way like they say, where is the information about the size and the spatial dimensions of this object stored over here? You can say, where is the information of the model of the other agent stored in this? How is it stored? What parts of this circuitry are coding for the other agent's behavior? What part is comparing its own drives and goals? So a whole lot of social mental states and mental representations, where they are encoded, how they are encoded. We don't know how they evolve. That would be too hard to do. But if you follow Tenenbaum's suggestion of putting in a psychology engine of some sort, then one can work with some toy model like this, and rather than trying to work with an actual data of actual model of ants and bees, what one can do is one can use this as a universal model where different connectomes over here, one can put in different connectomes of humans, bees, ants, deep learning networks, and use this as a toy model system with some kind of priors to actually compute these whole versus parts measures and do a realistic comparison of maybe not all of these, but at least a few of these species here with these. So they might be a practical way to do that. The obvious limitations will be that when you want to compare different species and everything is different right at the level of the substrate and the mechanisms and the dynamics, you need to pin down on some universal toy model, which you might then modulate. And this might be one way to do that. So that's why this study might be interesting. It also kind of points to how you might be able to actually track information flow at the functional level and parse complexity in terms of functions. So I'm mentioning these extra things to point out what the limitations of a morphospace might be and what the way might be to going further from it. One last kind of insight that comes out of studying a morphospace of complexity is that it actually suggests to us different embodiments of consciousness itself. So there are 4 kind of embodiments of consciousness that it suggests. Now, if you remember, this is the same space, but I put it on a Boolean graph. As you notice, humans were sitting here. AI goes in this direction. Now, and artificial life goes in this direction. And you saw a whole bunch of other things spiraling over here. One of the things you can ask in a kind of parsing like this is that for a moment, if you don't, as we have done over here, we don't talk about qualia. We simply talk about consciousness in terms of these complexities. We don't know to what level these complexities would be considered conscious or not. But if you ask yourself the question that among these agents that you saw before, what would it take, or where would you need to be on the space to actually solve the H5W problem, to actually solve that complete problem that I laid down before, because that problem includes the social aspect, the computational aspect, in a sense, the autonomous aspect. What would it take to solve that problem? And if you ask the question that way, what you'll realize is that, well, by that measure, one could conceive embodiments of agents which solve that problem, which in fact lie at this point of the scale. They are very high on computation. They are high on social interactions, meaning with other conspecifics of the same kind, and artificial systems. They might not have any autonomous functionality, but some of these deep networks that can actually interact with other networks, or chat GPT like systems that can learn from themselves or other systems, they might sit at this point, and they might, if at this point, again, we don't know what is qualia and what is first person experience for them. But if they are sitting, if systems come to this point here, they might be able to actually solve the H5W problem. They might be able to do everything that we typically associate with with the functionality that we otherwise say a conscious agent is doing. Or in terms of that functionality, it might pass the Turing test. You might not be able to tell what it is if you don't see it. Another place where a system could gain an H5W type of functionality might be over here. Here it might be doing things that synthetic biology might, in fact, this might be the goal of synthetic biology, to have things that are very high on autonomous functionality, might have a whole bunch of interactions with other agents, might be some kind of multicellular organisms or smart tissues or smart viruses, etc. They might not be very high on computation, but they might have a whole bunch of internal drives to self-sustain and preserve themselves for, let's say, low-level functionality. So synthetic consciousness might be very different from biological consciousness in terms of these complexity classes, and it might be, I'm just using the word consciousness, not again in terms of first-person experience, but in terms of what it might be doing that might to us appear like something that is passing a Turing test. So these are the biological things we already mentioned. Two other embodiments that seem to be suggested is group consciousness. Group consciousness would typically be sitting again over here, as in a group could be an entire organization. I'm not able to at this point pinning down that it's a human organization, but for example, why I'm saying that think of groups is important is for one reason, that think about it this way. In some sense, we think of ourselves as a conscious individual, but in a way, if you think of us at the level in terms of the cells, we are a group of all those cells. Not a single cell of us is conscious in the same way like we are. Who knows if it is in any other sense, but collectively something has come out at the level of the group. In the same sense, it could be that agents may be conscious, maybe not. A kind of, it could be like a collective intelligence of it could be a culture. It could be a culture. It could be an organization. It could be some social strata like a hive of bees or something, or even a swarm of robots that might have some level of group consciousness that might not exist at the individual level, because as a group they have somehow internalized certain drives for self-preservation and processes to enable that to solve certain problems. In that case, the social interaction would not be within the group, but it would be between groups. A group by itself is not going to be conscious. But if you kind of build a toy model or a game theoretic toy model with groups that are interacting with different groups, one might imagine a kind of group consciousness. This is a little strange type, because this is unlike the others. This is not even localized. So you might wonder what type of this group is like a fluid model. It's like a fluid system. It's not a rigid system where all the parts are just cranked together in one place. It's like a fluid system having some kind of ability to solve the functionality of consciousness. And the last one, which I think is probably the most realistic compared to synthetic or group, is what I'm calling simulated consciousness. So by simulated consciousness, I'm referring to a simulation of avatars which are either wired or learned certain drives relating to the physics, psychology, and other engines, where within they would mostly be sitting here, but within the simulation, they are doing everything that you would qualify as functionality to solve the H5 problem within the environment. They might not be conscious in the sense of interacting with the programmer, but within the system, they are self-sustaining. And as within the simulation, this is kind of close to the simulation hypothesis even. This means that if you build a simulation where that agent acquires certain capabilities, it will start doing things that you didn't program it to. And the only way as a programmer you might get access to it, you might be seeing the code that's running this. But somewhere that code is correcting itself. It's having a representation of its drives and is going close to it. In the same way, like Beer and Williams call this a minimally cognitive agent. If these things were equipped with psychology and physics engines and other things, it might in fact be more realistic to think of simulated consciousness or some form of proto-simulated consciousness extending these models compared to the kind of Hollywood scenarios that we are hearing nowadays, with robots getting 2 arms and 2 legs and coming to take over humanity. I think simulated consciousness is probably the closest and the simplest to investigate in a scientific way, and it will be probably sitting at axis may be a little bit here, depending on what type of complexity you give. But it's not conscious in the sense that it will interact with the programmer. It is consciousness really very not domain specific, but domain restricted within that environment. Beyond that, there is not anything to call it conscious. Again, no one knows what qualia and other things will be. But these are some of the suggestions that came out. So I should end now because I know I'm badly out of time. I'm happy to take questions, or I mean, I have enough time to sit here and we can discuss as long, but I don't know how